I'll be covering Proposition 21. I have the simplest title, which is Local Rent Control Initiative. And this is actually sponsored by the president of the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, is the one that's making the major push for it. This is a reiteration of a proposition that came up 2 years ago. So I'll be going into that. But before going into the nuts and bolts of the proposition itself, the main impetus for this proposition and for a lot of the initiatives that you'll see coming up is housing and the lack thereof of affordable housing. So just to share a few statistics with you in terms of housing, the median rents in California are actually higher than in any other state. A majority of California renters are paying more than 30% of their income towards rent, and a third are spending more than half of their income towards rent. And according to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, if you've done any research into this, you probably have heard this already, but someone earning minimum wage would have to work 92 hours a week in order to afford an average one-bedroom apartment. Here's a little graphic to just show the gap between median rents and median wages in California since 2000. This comes from the California Department of Housing and Development, Community Development. So if you see at the beginning here with year 2000, for the median wage, it's actually gone up and down a bit, but mainly down for the first 15 years, and then has been slightly on the rise ever since. Whereas with median rents, they have continued to go up a little bit of not as much of an increase in 2010, 2011, but still steadily increased. And so the gap between the wages that people are earning and the rents that they're paying have increased. That gap has increased over the years. So Prop 21 is actually a directly addresses this measure called Costa-Hawkins that was enacted in 1995. And what Costa-Hawkins did was to place limitations on local governments enacting rent control. So local governments, even if they enact rent control, those could not apply to buildings built after February 1995. So this would hopefully, the thought behind this is to encourage developers to build, because they wouldn't have to worry that they would be able to be exempt from that rent control. Exemption for single family homes, condos, and townhomes. And then a third provision was the vacancy decontrol, is what it's called. And it's a fancy way of saying, when a unit is voluntarily vacated, so when a tenant leaves a home, then the rent can be reset to market value by the landlord. So, which seems to make sense. So Prop 10, which was proposed in 2018, was basically an elimination of Costa-Hawkins altogether, but that was unsuccessful. So Prop 21, which is on the ballot this November, basically these are the main provisions addressing what I just said, which is the first, local governments will be allowed to enact rent control for buildings that are more than 15 years old. So now instead of the fixed date of February 1995, it would be more of a rolling period where right now we're in 2020, so 15 years back is 2005. Anything that's built after 2005 would be exempt, but those buildings that were built before then, so they could have been built after 1995, but now they would be potentially not exempted anymore from rent control. Secondly, there is an exemption in Prop 21 for natural persons, for owners, quote unquote, natural persons of no more than 2 residential dwelling or housing units. So this includes single family homes, condos, townhomes, multiplexes, apartments, each counted individually as a unit. And so if you own 2 or less, you're fine. 1 or 2, you're fine. But if you own 3 or more, you don't have that protection of the Costa-Hawkins ordinance. You could actually be exposed to local rent control. Another key thing, as I mentioned, natural persons. So if you own your property in a trust or an LLC or some other means, you could potentially be open to rent control, because that is not a natural person, as opposed to before, when all single family homes and condos and townhomes were just exempt. And then thirdly, that vacancy decontrol, where if a tenant just voluntarily leaves, the local laws may now control rental rates if this passed, and but they would need to allow landlords to increase the rates, but by no more than 15% over the subsequent 3 years. So now it's getting to where you can't just automatically increase to market rate. The local government might be able to limit you down to 15% over 3 years, however you break that down. So arguments for Prop 21, the main argument is simple: rents are too high and something needs to be done. And I don't think anybody is debating that. That's not a question. When I first started real estate and we were going through the recession, many economists were coming out and saying, even though we seem like we have enough inventory now, the builders are not building enough. And in 5, 10 years, 15 years, we're going to have a major housing crisis. And that's what we're facing right now. And so affordability is not a question. And so the main argument for Prop 21 is we just need to do something. And this is going to free up some ability for governments to enact rent control. And that's related to the second argument, which is Prop 21, it's not an automatic establishment of rent control. So just because it passes doesn't mean that everybody's under rent control. What it does is to give local jurisdictions the right to do so in accordance with what they feel is right for their communities. So it comes down to more of a jurisdictional thing where, do you want the state to tell you what you can and cannot do, or would you want to allow the local governments to hopefully understand their own community and what's necessary and be able to enact accordingly? Arguments against Prop 21. One of the arguments against that is that owners of rental property may see income from investments diminish as costs increase, but their rent increases are limited. And many of you probably are familiar with AB 1482 that was already enacted as of January 1st of this year. I'm not going to go into that, and we actually did cover that in another seminar, but that already has some amount of rental cap provisions statewide. But if there's more local rent control, then that could be even more restrictive. The second is this loss of vacancy decontrol, which means that even if a tenant leaves, the owner might not be able to increase that rent to market rate. And so that's another argument against it. May encourage, quote unquote, investment property owners to sell property because if their costs are increasing and their rents aren't if it's not making sense financially, or they're not even able to afford keeping that housing, they may need to sell. And that could be actually taking affordable rental housing out of commission, so out of stock. So that's another argument. And then if you don't have a rent that's at market value, it may have an impact on resale value should the owner decide to sell, because people are going to be, any potential investors are going to be looking at what is the income like on the property. Some further ones: the owners of rental property may not be able to maintain their property due to the rising costs of materials and labor. And that may in turn lead to lower quality housing. So there could be an issue there. Puts at risk those whose retirement portfolio consists mainly of investment property. And then with different localities enacting different measures, it could make things more challenging for owners. So if there is local rent control in different cities and you have properties in multiple cities, you're going to really have to be careful, how you proceed with each property, and just be aware of all the local regulations. And then finally, the argument is that this could pave the way to eventually just eliminating protections for owners of any owners of investment property. So as I mentioned at the beginning, Prop 10 was trying to eliminate Costa-Hawkins, and that didn't work, so they're trying to do this. And so the argument is that it could potentially just kind of be that stepping stone where that could happen. A second one to consider, a second major category to consider in terms of arguments against Prop 21 is the developers. So there is the thought that this may discourage developers from building more housing stock, which is really the main reason for lack of affordable housing in the first place. And just to note that California has one of the strictest housing policies, stringent building codes, and slow, complex approval processes compared to other areas of the country. Developmental fees, which is not the cost to build the unit, but just the fees that you need to pay to even start, and there are different fees locally as well, average about 22,000 per unit in California. And that's that's compared to about 6,000 in the rest of the country. And then here in California, we do have the CEQA Environmental Impact Review, which is required for any new housing project. So that also is an increased cost and increased time. And so as it is, developers, it's kind of stacked against the developers, or it is a little more difficult for developers to build here. And but that's what we need, is more housing. So just simply limiting, if we allow more governmental, local rent control, and if the local governments actually enact it, that could actually discourage them from being able to move forward. So organizations in favor of Prop 21 include the United Farm Workers, the ACLU of Southern California, Los Angeles Tenants Union, which is a huge tenants union, and there are other tenant groups as well, the National Lawyers Guild, and then the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. And then also the California Democratic Party endorses this, which is interesting because actually the governor, who is a Democrat, actually is against it. Organizations against, California Council for Affordable Housing and Bay Area Housing Advocacy Coalition. So this is interesting to me because these are affordable housing groups, and they're actually coming out and saying that they don't think that this provision is the right way to deal with the affordable housing crisis. And the National Taxpayers Union, California Builders Alliance, and various trade unions, the American Legion, California Seniors Advocates League, and Congress of California Seniors. Again, the seniors group tend to generally be toward more of, skewed toward, let's get more affordable housing because that's necessary, and yet they're against this measure. So that concludes just to wrap up, basically whatever you're considering in terms of all three of these, whether you own property or not, whether you're a business owner, an individual, a renter, just if you have property as part of your retirement portfolio, or you're building your retirement portfolio, or you're hoping to be able to pass property on to your heirs someday, these measures are really important. So that's kind of the take-home message, as Philip mentioned at the beginning. No matter what your views are, we just really want to encourage you to vote.